Gold does not save you in a collapse. In 2018, in Caracas, Venezuela, people were trading gold jewelry not because gold lost its value, but because, in that moment, this is the part most people never understand, they think collapse is about money failing. It isn't. It's about value shifting, and it shifts faster than most people can react. In the next few minutes, you're going to see documented patterns where the things people trusted most and the things they ignored. This isn't theory. This is how systems actually break. And once you see the pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. What you're looking at isn't a rare event. It's a pattern, and it has repeated across different countries, different systems, and completely different time periods. In Venezuela, living standards collapsed by more than 70% in less than a decade. Stores emptied, supply chains broke, and people began trading whatever they had for whatever they needed. Not at market prices, but at survival prices. The same thing happened in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union fell. Money still existed, but it stopped working the way people expected. Shops had goods, but not the ones people needed. People had money, but not the things that mattered. And when that disconnect grows large enough, something critical breaks. Not the currency, the system behind it. This is where most people get it wrong. They think collapse begins when money becomes worthless. But by the time that happens, the real shift has already taken place. Because collapse doesn't start with numbers, it starts with behavior. With people quietly changing what they are willing to accept and what they are no longer willing to trade. And once that line is crossed, value stops being universal. It becomes personal, situational, and brutally selective. Once that shift begins, the system doesn't adapt. It contracts. Markets don't reorganize into something better. They fragment into something smaller. Instead of thousands of transactions happening across a network, you get isolated exchanges between individuals. One person who has something, another person who needs it, and nothing in between. No pricing system, no standard value, no guarantee that what you hold today will mean anything tomorrow. This is the part that breaks most assumptions, because in a functioning economy, value is abstract. It's stored, measured, transferred through systems people trust. But when those systems fail, value becomes immediate. It's no longer about what something is worth over time, it's about what it can do right now. Food, if you haven't eaten. Heat, if the temperature drops below zero. Medicine, if your body is running out of time. And in those moments, something very specific happens. People stop asking, how much is this worth? And start asking, what problem does this solve? That single shift redefines everything. Because most things we consider valuable are built for stability. They assume time exists. They assume exchange continues. They assume someone else will always be willing to take them. But in a collapsing system, none of those assumptions hold. Time compresses. Decisions become urgent. And the distance between having something and being able to use it gets wider. This is why people with resources still find themselves unable to act. Not because they lack value, but because their value is no longer compatible with reality. And when that happens, the system doesn't just become inefficient. It becomes selective. Only the things that directly solve problems continue to move. Everything else slows down, then stops. And once it stops, it doesn't matter how valuable it used to be, because in that moment, value isn't determined by history, it's determined by necessity, right now. You can see this mechanism clearly the moment you stop looking at theory and start looking at what people actually did. In Venezuela, during the peak of the crisis, inflation reached levels where prices could change within days, sometimes hours. Money still existed, but it stopped functioning as a reliable tool, because holding it meant losing value, constantly. So people adjusted, not all at once, but gradually. At first, they tried to spend faster. Then they tried to convert it into something more stable. And eventually, they stopped thinking in terms of money at all. Transactions became direct, practical, immediate. A bottle of cooking oil could be traded for multiple meals. A few liters of gasoline could secure transportation for days. Batteries, soap, basic supplies, things that once felt ordinary, became negotiation tools. Not because they were rare in a global sense, but because locally, they solved real problems. And that's the key. Value didn't disappear. It relocated. Away from abstraction, toward utility. And once that relocation begins, it spreads, because people learn fast. They watch what works. They observe what others are willing to trade for. And they adjust their behavior accordingly. This is how a new system forms. not by design, but by necessity. And in that system, something becomes very clear. The closer an item is to solving an immediate problem, the more liquid it becomes. The easier it moves, the faster it trades, the more people are willing to accept it, without hesitation. Meanwhile, everything else starts to struggle, not because it has no value, but because it has the wrong kind of value for that moment. And this is where the gap widens, between what people think is valuable and what actually works. And once that gap becomes visible, it changes how people prepare, how they trade, and how they survive. At first, the changes are subtle. Nothing announces itself. There's no moment where someone says, "This is the new currency." It emerges quietly, through repetition. Small transactions that start working, better than others. In multiple collapses, people began to notice the same thing. Some items moved faster. They were accepted without discussion, without negotiation, without delay. You didn't have to explain their value. Everyone already understood it. And that made them powerful. Not because they were expensive, but because they were easy. Easy to recognize, easy to exchange, easy to use. In unstable environments, simplicity becomes an advantage. The fewer assumptions an item requires, the more useful it becomes. Because nobody has time to evaluate complex value. Nobody wants to calculate. They want certainty, immediate, practical certainty. And that's why small, consumable items often outperform everything else. Not because they last, but because they don't need to. They solve a problem, and then they're gone. Which creates something important: constant demand. Every use resets the need. Every transaction creates the next one. And that keeps them moving, fast. This is very different from the kind of value most people are used to, because we're taught to think in terms of preservation, holding, storing, protecting value over time. But in unstable systems, flow matters more than storage. Movement matters more than ownership. And the things that move the fastest quickly become the things people trust the most. Not because they're perfect, but because they work, right now, without hesitation. Some forms of demand don't negotiate. They don't wait. They don't adjust. They don't disappear when conditions get worse. They intensify, and that changes how value behaves. In multiple closed systems, prisons, isolated communities, and collapsing economies, one pattern appears again and again. Items tied to dependency move faster than anything else, not because they're essential in a rational sense, but because they're essential to the person who needs them. And that distinction matters. Because when someone needs something badly enough, they stop thinking in terms of price. They think in terms of relief. And relief has no stable cost. It expands to match urgency. This is why certain small items become disproportionately powerful. They're portable, divisible, recognizable. But more importantly, they are immediately desired by a specific group of people who will always exist, which creates something unique: guaranteed liquidity. There is always someone willing to accept them, always someone willing to trade. And that reliability becomes more valuable than durability. Because in unstable systems, you don't need something that lasts forever. You need something you can use, or move, right now. This is where most people miscalculate. They focus on what should matter, instead of what actually moves. But systems don't reward logic. They reward behavior. And behavior, under pressure, follows very different rules. Rules that are simple, immediate, and often uncomfortable to accept. There's another form of demand that goes even deeper than dependency: pain. Not discomfort, not inconvenience, real pain. The kind that doesn't wait, the kind that doesn't negotiate. In stable systems, pain is managed. You go to a doctor, you take medication, you follow a process. But when systems fail, that process disappears. Injuries go untreated, infections spread. Sleep becomes difficult, stress becomes constant, and suddenly, relief becomes one of the most valuable things a person can access. Not because it creates long-term value, but because it reduces immediate suffering, even temporarily, and that's enough. In multiple crises, items that offer relief, physical or psychological, begin to circulate rapidly. They are used to ease pain, to reduce anxiety, to make unbearable situations manageable. And because of that, people trade for them without hesitation, without calculation, without waiting for a better deal, because waiting makes the pain worse. This is where value shifts again, from utility to experience, from survival to endurance. Because surviving isn't just about staying alive, It's about being able to continue, to function, to think, to endure what's happening. And anything that makes that possible, even briefly, gains power. Not permanent power, but immediate influence. And in unstable systems, immediacy always wins, over logic, over planning, over everything that depends on time. There's one category of need that overrides everything else: time. Not time in the abstract sense, but time that is running out. Because when time becomes limited, value compresses, decisions accelerate, and trade-offs disappear. In stable systems, health is something people manage over years: appointments, treatments, access to consistent care. But when systems break, health becomes immediate, binary. You either get what you need or you don't. And in that moment, the value of anything else collapses, because nothing competes with survival. This is where the shift becomes undeniable. People don't just change what they prefer, they change what they're willing to give up, completely. Items that once represented savings, status, or long-term security are exchanged instantly for a single outcome: more time. One more day, one more chance, one more opportunity to recover. And when that happens, pricing stops making sense, because the person on one side of the exchange is no longer optimizing. They are reacting to urgency, to fear, to the possibility that waiting even a few more hours might be too late. This is why certain items become disproportionately powerful, not because they are rare, but because they are irreplaceable in that moment. You can delay comfort, you can delay convenience, you can even delay safety, but you cannot delay survival. And anything that directly affects that immediately rises above everything else. No debate, no comparison, no hesitation. Because when time runs out, value becomes absolute. Up to this point, everything we've looked at has been personal: individual needs, individual decisions, individual trades. But there's another layer that operates above all of that: the system itself. Because no matter how people adapt, no matter how they trade, everything still depends on something deeper: energy. Not money, not assets, not stored wealth. Energy. The ability to move, to produce, to heat, to cook, to function. In stable systems, this layer is invisible. It's built into everything. You don't think about it because it's always there. But when systems fail, this becomes the bottleneck. And when something becomes a bottleneck, it becomes power. Because nothing moves without it. Not goods, not people, not systems. Everything slows down to match its availability. And that creates a new kind of value. Not based on preference, not based on demand curves, but based on dependency. If something cannot happen without a specific input, that input becomes critical. And critical things are never priced normally. They're controlled, negotiated, prioritized. This is why, in multiple crises, access to energy becomes more important than almost anything else. Not because it's rare globally, but because it's constrained locally. And when that constraint appears, it reshapes everything around it. What gets produced, what gets transported, what gets traded, even what people consider possible. Because without energy, systems don't just weaken, they stall. And once they stall, everything built on top of them starts to collapse with it. Everything we've looked at so far shares one characteristic. It gets used, and then it's gone. Food is consumed, fuel is burned, medicine is taken. And once it's gone, the need returns, which creates a cycle: constant demand, constant pressure, constant dependency. But in longer disruptions, something begins to change. People stop thinking about what they can trade and start thinking about what they can produce. Because relying on exchange becomes exhausting, uncertain, unstable, and eventually unsustainable. So the focus shifts from access to control. Not control over others, but control over outcomes. The ability to generate what you need without waiting for someone else to provide it. And when that shift happens, value changes again, quietly, but fundamentally. Items that enable production start to rise, not because they solve one problem, but because they solve many, repeatedly. A tool doesn't just help once, it keeps working. A system doesn't just deliver value, it produces it, over time. And that changes how people think. Because instead of asking, "What can I trade this for?" they begin asking, "What can this create?" And that question has a very different answer. Because creation compounds, it builds, it reduces dependency. And in unstable environments, reducing dependency is one of the most powerful advantages a person can have. Not visible, not immediate, but incredibly durable. Because while everything else is being consumed, this is the only category that keeps generating value long after the trade is over. If you step back and look at everything we've covered, a pattern starts to emerge. Not random, not emotional, structured, predictable. Because even in collapse, value still follows rules, just not the ones people expect. In stable systems, value is shaped by markets, supply, demand, time. But when those systems break, a different formula takes over, much simpler, much harsher. Value becomes a function of three things: necessity, availability, and urgency. Not what something is worth in theory, but how badly it's needed, how hard it is to get, and how quickly it's required. And when those three align, value spikes, violently, because there's no buffer, no system to smooth it out, no time to negotiate. This is why certain items move instantly, and others don't move at all. Not because they lack value, but because they fail one of those variables. They're not necessary, or not scarce, or not urgent. And in unstable environments, failing just one is enough to make something irrelevant. This is also why timing becomes everything, because the same item can move through all three states: essential, then optional, then ignored, depending on when you try to use it. And that's where most people fail. They prepare for value as if it's fixed, but it isn't. It's conditional. And once conditions change, so does everything built on top of them. You can understand all of this in theory, but it becomes very different when it happens in real life. In the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, millions of people found themselves in exactly that position. The system didn't disappear overnight, but it stopped functioning the way people expected. Salaries were delayed, supply chains broke down, stores had shelves, but often nothing on them. Money still existed, but it no longer guaranteed access. And when that realization spread, behavior changed quickly. At first, people tried to hold on to stability, foreign currency, savings, anything that felt reliable. But most didn't have access to those options, so they adapted. They began trading what they had, directly, goods for goods, service for service. And in that environment, something became very clear. What you owned mattered less than what you could use. There are documented accounts of people exchanging valuables, items saved over decades, for things that in normal conditions would have seemed insignificant, because those insignificant things solved immediate problems: food, fuel, medicine. In one case, a father described trading a piece of family jewelry for a short course of treatment his child needed. Not because it was a fair exchange, but because it was the only one available. And that's the reality most people never prepare for. Not losing value, but losing the ability to convert it when it matters most. At this point, it's easy to draw the wrong conclusion, to assume that some forms of value simply stop mattering. But that's not what happens. They don't disappear, they shift. And more importantly, they return. Because collapse doesn't last forever. Systems break, but they also rebuild. Markets disappear, but they come back. And when they do, the hierarchy of value changes again, almost completely. The things that once moved the fastest, the things that kept people alive, are gone, consumed, used when they were needed most. But the things that remained, the things that weren't used, begin to matter again. A different kind of value, not immediate, not urgent, but persistent. This is the paradox. The items that help you survive are rarely the ones that help you recover. And the items that help you recover often don't help you survive, because they serve different phases, different conditions, different timelines. And most people prepare for only one of them. They focus on long-term value and struggle in the short term. Or they focus on survival and have nothing left when stability returns. But the pattern suggests something else. The people who navigate these transitions best are not the ones who pick one side. They're the ones who understand when to switch. Go back to that moment, standing in a place that looks familiar but no longer works the way it used to. You're holding something valuable, something that took time to build, time to protect, time to believe in. And yet, in that moment, it doesn't solve the problem in front of you. Not because it failed, but because the conditions changed. That's the part most people never see coming. They prepare for risk, they prepare for loss, but they don't prepare for value itself to shift. Quietly, without announcement, without warning. And by the time it becomes obvious, the window to react has already narrowed. This isn't about predicting collapse. It's about recognizing patterns, because the pattern is consistent, across time, across systems, across different versions of the same mistake. Value is not fixed. It moves. And when it moves fast enough, it doesn't just change outcomes, it exposes them. The only question is, when that shift happens again, will you recognize it before it's too late?